It's November 2018. We're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about halfway between Peru and Australia. Here, 3,000 miles away from any continent, a tiny, rugged island rises out of the sea. It's called Pitcairn Island, and today, its 47 residents have come to the island's small cemetery to gather around a plaque. It reads, "To say we're sorry does not seek punishment or blame. It doesn't say they were right and we were wrong, just that we have learnt and understood the error of our ways." It refers to the island's long, difficult and dark history, which was once the centre of a global scandal. It refers to how this idyllic island was home to a culture of rape and sexual assault against girls as young as 7, and how everyone on the island knew about it. This is an extraordinary story about a desperate fight for justice in one of the world's most isolated places. This is True Crime Reports, a global crime show from Al Jazeera. Today's episode, A Tiny Island's Big Secret. In the 1990s, Dennis McGookin was a detective superintendent with the Kent Police in southeast England.
My story today starts with taking me back to September 1996, when I was asked if I would take on a criminal investigation into an allegation of sexual assault on Pitcairn Island, 9,000 miles away from Kent.
The island has a unique history. One of a group of 4 islands, Pitcairn Island had been settled in the late 1700s by a crew of mutineers aboard a ship called the HMS Bounty. Led by a man named Fletcher Christian, the crew had brought with them women from the island of Tahiti. The Pitcairns officially became a British overseas territory in 1838, but for the next 150 years, the British government largely left the island and the people who lived there alone. What actually went on there was more or less a complete unknown. That all changes in 1996, when the first layer of this dark tale is peeled back. A man had approached the British authorities, saying that his 11-year-old daughter had been raped on Pitcairn. The British government decided they should investigate. They send 2 detectives, Peter George and Dennis McGookin. For Dennis, the journey out there was one of the most memorable of his life.
We didn't see land for 5 or 6 days. The weather was so bad, we were virtually on top of the island before we could actually see it through all the mist and cloud and rain. So the longboats came out from Pitcairn Island, come alongside the cargo ship, and literally the waves were sort of, up 20 feet, down 20 feet.
Pitcairn Island is a very windy place. The red cliffs, draped in coconut, banyan and breadfruit trees, rise 500 feet above the choppy waves below. At points in the island's history, these cliffs have killed more islanders than old age. The longboats take Dennis and his colleague to land. From there, they're led to the main settlement, Adamstown.
Adamstown, it's almost like a small market square where you have the church, you've got the village hall, and outside the village hall, very, very impressive indeed, was the original anchor from HMS Bounty, and that is displayed there.
For food, the islanders catch fish, grow their own fruit and vegetables, and keep bees for honey. At one point, they curiously earned money by selling rare stamps to collectors. But sales have dwindled, and the island actually went bankrupt for a time. They also receive a little income from tourists, mainly fans of the history of the HMS Bounty, made famous through multiple Hollywood films. Dennis's first impression of the islanders reminds him of that history.
The looked almost like modern-day pirates, in as much as they were scruffily dressed, long hair, the men had beards, everyone was in their bare feet, and that was the way they were. Most of the men carried knives of some sort or other, not in a threatening way, but just as this is part of island life.
Dennis says that the islanders were friendly and welcomed both the officers into their homes. One of these islanders is called Steve Christian. Like many of the other residents, he's directly descended from the HMS Bounty sailors who'd arrived here 200 years earlier. When Dennis arrives in 1996, reports say that, as well as other odd jobs, Steve serves as the island's only dentist. He'll go on to become its mayor.
For a lot of people, he was actually Mr. Pitcairn. He would actually be the island dentist, unqualified. He would be a radiologist, unqualified, and he would turn his hands to everything. He would pilot the boats, he would go fishing. Everybody knew Steve. Steve had an opinion on absolutely everything. There was nothing happening on that island that Steve didn't know about.
Steve Christian and his family are central to this tale, because the man accused of raping the 11-year-old girl, the man Dennis has been sent to investigate, is Steve Christian's son, Sean. Dennis says he and his colleagues spend 10 days there. He describes how, as the days pass, the atmosphere shifts.
It then became very obvious to us that a lot of people were pleased to see two police officers on the island. And people started to talk to us very, very privately, basically saying, this has been going on for far, far too long. The sexual behaviour of the men on the island as being illegal, for want of a better phrase, going on for generations and generations, and it's now time to stop. And in particular, several of the ladies basically said, it has to be stopped, and can you do something about it?
The two detectives eventually decide there's not enough evidence to pursue a charge against Sean Christian, so they return home. But back in England, they tell their superiors about what they saw and heard. Rumours of sexual wrongdoing going back generations, as well as other things too. A worryingly lax attitude towards mixing guns and alcohol. And what the detectives say is a basically non-existent legal system. Articles since have found the Pitcairn Island statutes from that time, and it turns out there's no specific law about rape. Sex with a minor is referred to as carnal knowledge and is punishable by 100 days in jail. The age of consent is constantly being disputed. Sometimes it's 15. Sometimes it's 12. In any case, at this point, 1996, there isn't even a jail on the island. One report says there's only one old cell which they use to store life jackets. They have a police officer, but apparently she's never made an arrest.
There was no enforcement of the law whatsoever on Pitcairn. The law of the land out there was basically that if you're caught stealing something like that, you have your knuckles rapped, but the chances of you being prosecuted are virtually nil. Crime was being committed, no doubt about that, whether it was theft of government property or general misbehaviour and the like, but nothing was actually happening to bring it under control.
The detectives are worried. They recommend that the UK government sends out a full-time policeman. The government instead sends an officer to lead short-term training sessions with the Pitcairners to bring them up to scratch on policing and crime. The officer's name is Gail Cox.
I know Gail very well. I knew her. She was a first-class neighbourhood police officer in Kent, and she was a very, very capable individual.
Gail lands in Adamstown for the first time in 1997. She delivers the first 12-week round of training, then goes back to London. 2 years later, she'll return for the next round. Shortly after Gail Cox returns to the Pitcairns, two 15-year-old girls approach her. They say they want to talk. This is where the second layer of this tale begins to unravel. A layer which will eventually lead to the Pitcairn's closely held secrets being exposed for the entire world to see. It's November 1999, on police officer Gail Cox's second visit to Pitcairn, when, according to a report in the magazine Vanity Fair, she was approached by two 15-year-old girls. They tell her they've been sexually assaulted by a 19-year-old from New Zealand called Ricky Quinn. Ricky had come to the islands to visit, they say, and he'd raped them. Gail is appalled at what the girls are telling her and pushes for Quinn to be taken to court. But this will prove much more difficult than she thinks. Many of the islanders, who until now have been nothing but friendly, become very resistant. According to the report, Gail is told she just doesn't get it. That's just how it is here. 15-year-old girls have sex. Then, one of the girls makes a new accusation. Apparently, she tells Gail that when she was just 11, she was gagged and raped by two brothers, Sean Christian, whose name we already know, and his brother Randy Christian, the sons of Mayor Steve Christian. Gail keeps pushing, and eventually she succeeds. Ricky Quinn pleads guilty to one count of carnal knowledge and is sentenced, under island law, to the maximum of 100 days in prison. Vanity Fair reports that his conviction was later overturned. The British government can no longer ignore what's sitting right in front of them. What they initially thought was an isolated case is starting to look much bigger than that. And so begins Operation Unique. Dennis is one of the officers who's involved.
I was back in England, and on a Saturday lunchtime, my phone rang, and it was Gail ringing me from Pitcairn Island, basically saying that the lid's come off here. Girls are now talking about being raped. We've had several girls raped by some visitors who are friends of Pitcairners, and that basically she needs some help to get on with this. This is where we got the green light from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to basically let's launch a much bigger inquiry into that.
It's 8 o'clock on an evening sometime later, it's not clear when, and two of Dennis's colleagues, British detectives Peter George and Rob Vinson, are knocking on a door in Auckland in the north of New Zealand. According to Peter George, they've come to visit a young woman. She used to live on Pitcairn Island, and the detectives have been told she's a friend of the girl who says she was raped by the mayor's sons. The door opens, and the woman answers. The officers explain why they're there and ask her if she knows anything about her friend's accusation. She says she doesn't. The officers, disappointed, turn to go. But then the woman keeps talking. She casually mentions that she was raped on the island when she was 10. She goes on. According to the detectives, she says they won't find a single girl on Pitcairn who's reached the age of 12 and is still a virgin. This is what the officers have been looking for. George later says they bring the woman to the police station, where she begins to give them name after name, incident after incident. A book titled Pitcairn Paradise Lost describes how, over the next 2 years, the British detectives will travel around the world questioning women who'd grown up on the Pitcairns.
And every single one of them described how they had been sexually assaulted and named names as to who the offenders were.
24 women will make statements, and Operation Unique will uncover more than 100 allegations of sexual abuse against 31 men, including the mayor, Steve Christian. some of them dating back generations. All of the women were underage at the time of the crimes. One of them was just 7. But as the detectives work their way through the list and question the men, they uncover a deeply unnerving obstacle. According to reports, the men who are being accused don't seem to think there's an issue. It's just Polynesian culture, they say. Here's Dennis.
At that time, I honestly believe that they didn't realise how serious it was, what they were doing. That they thought it was just fair game that the young girl maybe turned 13, 14 years of age, and she is now ready to have sex with men, whether she wants to or not. Every single female on that island has been sexually abused at some stage or other in their younger life. And the domestic violence is still going on that island at that very point in time. Grown women were still being physically abused, and young girls were still being sexually abused.
And many of the island's women come out in support of the men too. Steve Christian's wife calls a community meeting at their house. The women gather. Some journalists also attend the meeting. They later describe the discussion they hear between the women. Sex is like food on the table, the women apparently agree, before asking, who are these overzealous outsiders telling us how to live our lives? Some of the islanders, though, shift uncomfortably in their chairs. One report describes how one of them, Carol Warren, says that a man tried to rape her when she was 10. The tiny community of Adamstown begins to splinter.
There was quite a lot of conflict, I understand, between those who had left the island and perhaps become more attuned to the mores and values of New Zealand or elsewhere, and those who remained on the island.
That's Sue Farran, a law professor at Newcastle University in England. She's a legal expert on Pacific Island states, including the Pitcairns.
There was quite a lot of acrimony from women on the island about those off the island who were reporting these cases. And in fact, some of those who were alleged victims actually withdrew their statements, coming under pressure from various sources.
As the evidence against the men mounts, over in London, preparations are underway for what is now a trial into systemic and historic abuse. Sue explains that there was one key question that had to be answered. Whose laws were the Pitcairners actually breaking?
One of the questions that arose quite early on was what law did these alleged offences fall under? What laws had been extended to Pitcairn? And there were questions around whether Pitcairn was in fact a British overseas territory, because as people may be aware, Pitcairn had been settled by mutineers who had seized the ship the Bounty and eventually landed on Pitcairn Island. And one of the arguments was that they were actually fleeing the application of any British law and so were not bound by it.
It's eventually decided that the trials will be held on the island itself. The British move in. More and more police officers arrive on the island, as well as social workers and journalists. Orders are given for a 6-cell prison to be built in Adamstown. The accused father and son were among the locals who helped the officers put the final touches to the prison. The men, building what are essentially cells meant for them, apparently take this as a sign a decision has already been made. Tensions grow. One visiting Brit writes home that, quote, "We are employing the natives in our gallows construction project." A journalist will later describe the islanders as unworldly, naive, and poorly educated. The Pitcairners feel they're being made into a spectacle. For Sue, it's easy to see why.
So there are all sorts of factors that made it a fascinating story, I think. The fact that the number of alleged crimes was so high in such a small population was definitely a media magnet. I think some of the tensions about living on a small island in a very small community also made it an interesting and exciting story.
Finally, it's September 2004. It's been almost 5 years since Operation Unique began, and it's time for the trial. Judges, prosecutors, defence lawyers and journalists make the 8-day journey by sea from New Zealand, and the island's population surges.
A whole legislative framework was established before the trials could be held. So courts were established, rules of procedure and evidence were established. The charges were, I think there were 31 charges of rape and a number of charges of sexual assault. And the trials went on for some time.
7 men living on Pitcairn stand accused. Some of them face multiple accusations from different women. The standout allegations are against the mayor himself, Steve Christian. He stands accused of repeatedly raping or assaulting a number of underage girls. One woman who testifies against him says he raped her 4 times. The first time was when she was 11 and Steve was 13. She describes what happened to the court. A group of them were outside, playing in the banyan trees, when she fell behind and lost her friends. Suddenly, 3 boys pounced on her, Steve and 2 others. 2 of them held her down while Steve raped her. She says that when he had finished, Steve invited the other 2 to do it as well. They said no. Steve Christian would later tell Vanity Fair that, quote, "It was all consensual sex." The defence lawyers, on appeal, make an argument for legal and moral relativism. They say that the locals had no idea that rape was a serious crime because English law was never enforced properly there. Sue questions this line of defence.
There were arguments made that the cultural and sexual mores of Pacific Islanders were distinct from those living in New Zealand. There was some attempt made to argue that their Polynesian ancestry made them distinct. I think that might have been drawing more on exoticism than reality.
On the 24th of October 2004, the judge makes his decision. Of the 7 accused, he finds 6 of them guilty of over 30 sex offences. This includes the mayor, Steve Christian, who the prosecution had described as having a, quote, callous and cavalier attitude towards his victims. Steve's son, Randy, is also sentenced, as well as Steve's brother-in-law, his father-in-law, and the island's postmaster. In all, the guilty men account for 1/3 of the island's adult men. And this is where we come to the next twist in this tale. The maximum penalty for rape is life in prison, but the men don't even get close to that. In his decision, the judge points to the small numbers of people living on the island. What will happen to them if they suddenly lose a large proportion of their working men? So, the sentences he hands down are, in the words of the prosecution, incredibly lenient. The island's postmaster, Dennis Christian, who apologised to his victims in the trial, gets the lightest sentence: 300 hours of community service. Here's Sue.
I'm not sure where the judge found the discretion to do that. The sentences by some would have been considered to be pretty light, particularly given this is a statutory crime.
Even after sentencing, Steve Christian continued to deny he did anything wrong. According to media reports, he refused to resign as mayor and so was fired by the British governor. The 6 men later appealed to the Privy Council in London, But their requests were denied. They began serving their sentences in late 2006. The last of them were released in April 2009.
And so by now, all the sentences have been served. A number of those accused are still on the island. They haven't left the island. And life goes on the island insofar as it can with such a very small population.
So, where are we today? The Pitcairns are still under foreign control, one of 14 island colonies still ruled by the UK. It's the last remaining holding of the British Empire in the Pacific, and it remains almost entirely dependent on aid from the British government. As of 2021, there were still 47 people living there. They have a tourism website, which puts out calls for people to come and visit. It says the trip is a must-see for adventurous travellers and for those who want to follow in the footsteps of the HMS Bounty mutineers. You can stay at Steve Christian's home for $200 a night. But as much as the islanders have tried to move on from their distressing past, it seems the problems have continued. In 2016, a man called Michael Warren, who'd replaced Steve Christian as mayor and who was working in child protection on the island, was found in possession of over 1,000 images of child abuse. He was sentenced to 20 months in prison. Steve Christian served as one of the assessors on the case. He's reported to have been utterly shocked, saying, "I know I did some bad things in the past, but never anything like that." After the sentencing of Michael Warren, a child protection system was put in place on the island, and 5 outside professionals, including a New Zealand police officer and a British diplomat, were stationed on the island. Local councillors underwent child protection training. Sue wonders how effective these measures will be.
Preventing this sort of behaviour when people are in remote and isolated communities, I think is very difficult. There is a reluctance to speak ill of your neighbour because you might need your neighbour tomorrow or the day after to help you ploughing a garden or repairing the 1 or 2 tractors on the island or manning the longboats to receive supplies. I don't think that's unusual in small, close-knit communities, but I think it does create particular policing challenges and safeguarding challenges.
We approached the official government of the Pitcairn Islands. We also approached the UK Foreign Office for comment. They said that while it would be inappropriate to comment on individual court decisions, the public prosecutor confirms that the sentences imposed in Operation Unique were consistent with the principles and authorities identified by the Crown at the time. They also say that in many cases, the victims in Operation Unique called for rehabilitative rather than severe sentences. The Foreign Office also says that, according to the Pitcairn Governor, the community on the island has worked hard to move on from what happened in a way that recognises and respects the victims. This included a community-wide process of acknowledgement and reconciliation in 2017 that involved everyone from the community, including the victims. A plaque of reconciliation was one of the things that came out of it. Sue explains why the islanders felt compelled to do this.
I have met some Pitcairners, and I think there is the concern among those on the island that they are now in some way tainted. And we shouldn't be doing that to the present generation, particularly given the difficulties of their lives on the island. And not so long ago, they unveiled a sort of tablet saying we recognise the wrongs of the past and hope to move forward. So not entirely an apology or reconciliation, but certainly a marker put down that it happened and they want to move forward in order to survive.
This was True Crime Reports, a global crime series from Al Jazeera. In our next episode, we're moving into the digital world for the story of Silk Road, one of the most controversial online marketplaces where drugs and guns were traded freely. Who was the man behind it? And did he deserve what he got? Thank you for joining. See you next week.